Hi, class. I just wanted to take a few minutes and go over the readings from last week before we get into our. We're going to work later this week. We're going to workshop our um, narrative essays, so that are due on Thursday. So I'll give out the instructions for doing that later this week. And so hopefully you'll spend most of your time early this week fine tuning those rough drafts to submit on Thursday. And then the way it will work, there's a due date on Thursday. If you miss that, you lose 10% of your grade. And then after we do the workshop, you'll turn it into me. And if you don't turn that in, you'll lose another 10%. And then the final due date is you can resubmit this as often as you'd like for the rest of the semester. And as I mentioned on day one of this semester, your grade can't go down. So you're only going to be rewarded for making the effort to improve your essays. So real briefly, this works a lot better if we could do it as a class discussion than me just kind of chatting to a camera. But I did want to point out a few things about these two stories and how they can help you in writing your narrative essays. So the first one I want to talk about Bartleby the Scrivener. So one of the things we've done, we've explored with our in-class exercises, we've explored how to convey meaning and to argue for a claim using just description, right? So as we did in our death penalty exercise. We've talked about ways the plot structure, thesis and counter thesis, using that inbuilt conflict in any narrative can be used to make an argument, right? So we've explored some narrative devices, and the one I want to focus on, another one we haven't focused on that I think these two essays model for you, is how to use symbolism to convey meaning and to argue for a specific message, right? And so the first one, Bartleby the Scrivener, and I should say at the outset that both of these stories have numerous possible correct interpretations that they're arguing that you can see them as arguing for different ideas. Um, what we say in humanities classes is that you're not looking necessarily for the correct answer. You're looking for the correct answer that you can defend. So in other words, there's more. It's not like a math class. There is more than one correct answer, but there are also incorrect answers. There are interpretations of the story that simply can't be defended or argued for. So I just want to again start with talking about Bartleby the Scrivener, and there can be different ideas. Probably if you go online, you can find some ways that that's been interpreted. Some of which has to do with the author's personal history and his struggles of getting things published, um, and that it might be argument about art in some way. Some have interpreted it as a sort of a Christian story with Bartleby as a stand-in for a kind of Christ under capitalism, so to speak. But I want to talk about the theme of alienation in this story and how that theme is developed through symbolism. And so in that case, the thesis for Bartleby the Scrivener, there are different ways you can say it, and some of the interpretations that you've given thus far come close to this, which is that this is a story about how the business world or capitalism alienates us from one another and prevents us from really caring for one another in the way that, say, charity sometimes demands of us. That real charity in this story is not possible, right? So our thesis then is that this story is arguing that within the world of Wall Street, and that's the symbol I want to spend most of the time talking about, the walls. Within the world of Wall Street, aka capitalism, this business world alienates us from one another and damages social relations. Okay, so for starters, we look at the different characters, and if we use that Aristotelian kind of model, we can start out with our exposition, and we see the different characters: Turkey, Nippers, Ginger Nut, the author whose name is never given, and then later on Bartleby. Right. So the first interesting thing to note is in with the characters is they're all named after food. And if you look at the descriptions of each of the characters, we know two things about them. We know what they eat, and we know how they work. And often the two things contrast with one another. One works really well in the morning, but he has an indigestion problem, so after lunchtime he's worthless, right? The other one has an alcohol issue and works really good in the afternoon, but not in the morning, right? And the other is just somebody who goes and gets ginger cakes for the other workers, a little boy. So that's all we know about them. We don't know about their family life. We don't know about their personal histories, their internal struggles. We don't know any of those things about them. So essentially, we know what the author knows, and the author is in relation to these characters their boss, right? So we kind of know. So this is one social relation: is the boss and employee, and it kind of shows that the limitations of that social relation. The two sides really can't see the full humanity of one another because of that social relation within the business world. And so, in this case, I think it's symbolized by walls. So if we're still at exposition, we hear about each of the characters at the beginning of the story, and we also have a description of the office. I won't read the whole thing to you, but my chambers were upstairs at number blank Wall Street. At one end, they looked upon the white wall of the interior of a spacious skylight shaft, et cetera, et cetera. And the view from the other end of my chambers offered at least a contrast, if nothing more. In that direction, my windows commanded an unobstructed view of a lofty brick wall, black by age and everlasting shade. So it's interesting. If we go further with that description, we see that we have sort of old school cubicles. They're dividers that divide each person's workspace, in other words, walls. And they work within walls that look out through windows upon more walls, right? And of course, the story is subtitled. It's Bartleby the Scrivener, a story of Wall Street. And Bartleby ultimately dies at the foot of a wall within the tombs at the end of the story. So walls um, are throughout this story, and that's just some of the examples. And so I think there we get this idea. What do walls do? Well, walls divide, right? We can look at other things outside of the story. Maybe walls can be put up for protection and things of this nature, but primarily the idea is that there are walls between the characters in this story, and most notably between the narrator and um, and Bartleby. So if we had more time, we would go into a discussion about the two main characters and what we think of them if we were doing an actual in-person discussion, but it doesn't really serve us for an online lecture, so to speak. Sufficeth to say that it is an interesting relationship, and here the key thing in this relationship is Bartleby. At first, it's a very good relationship, at least good um, in the way those relationships are prescribed in the business world under capitalism. Bartleby is a good worker and pleases his boss, and so his boss is good in return. And so there's that, in other words, their utility to each other is functions in such a way that it works, right? But then Bartleby says, one day I would prefer not to. And that becomes the mantra, his mantra, the only thing he says, right? And this is interesting because it's an interesting, as some of you pointed this out um, um, in your summaries and responses, it's not like giving the giving the man the bird and telling him to FO. It's not like a Che Guevara T-shirt with the. It's not a typical act of revolt, right? But what's interesting about it is that it's really the only way he could respond that would undermine the boss's authority, right? So imagine a scenario in which the boss says something like, um, don't do your work, right? That becomes an impossible scenario. If I don't do my work, um, then I'm obeying the boss's command, right? And if I do my work, then I'm under the dominion of the boss. There's no escape, right? So there always comes a point where the boss can issue a command that you can't escape. I prefer not to doesn't say, doesn't require you to respond to the boss as a boss, right? It's the one response that doesn't work, right? You can respond by "F you, I'm not going to do it." I'm thinking of any Rage fans in in the class. "F you, I won't do what you tell me." Something is not that kind of response, is it? But that's a rebel response that maintains the structure of authority. I prefer not to is different. I prefer not to suggest, for one thing, that what Bartleby wants and doesn't want to do matters. And of course, within that business relationship, it doesn't. He has to do that work whether he wants to or not. All of us have to do work that we don't want to do because we have to survive. We have to sell our labor, and all of us have to do schoolwork that we don't want to do because, and all of those things. But Bartleby says, no, what I want, my desires matter, and that's not my desire. So he really kind of escapes that. And so I think this is critical to the issue of charity. We see early on when the narrator gives a coat to, I think it's Nippers, or maybe it's Turkey, I forget, I'll have to check. Um, and it made him feel uppity. It made him feel his oats. Note the food language again, right? So all the efforts of charity are kind of go awry, and they do so in the sense that because it's within that world of business, and that world of business is the boss is investing in employees to do good work, so that then the profits will go back to, and so that they will produce not more than their actual wages, so the addition will go back to the boss, right? So that's the basic relationship. So you can't have charity under that sort of utilitarian relationship. You can't have two people who are seeing each other's full humanity because all you see is a function. This, as a worker, you are a function to the boss, and vice versa. My value to my boss is how well I work and can produce a surplus value that can be profit for the boss, right? So in other words, it's our functions, our utilitarian functions, that produce our value. Only Bartleby escapes that, and that becomes, and I think the brilliance of this story is that puts us in the same shoes as the narrator. The only way we can relate to Bartleby is outside of that business construct, beyond those walls, so to speak, in which we can only see Bartleby's humanity. That's the ending of the story, which is kind of ironic because Bartleby is almost like a piece of furniture and is described as such, but it says, "Ah, Bartleby, ah, humanity." So I think one thing that happens in this story is that the narrator undergoes a change. And the change is that he's confronted, just as we are in the story as readers, with someone who escapes the way social relations are defined under a capitalist system, so to speak. And so and I could do more. There's other examples. I think you might look at a few things. At one point, the narrator is thinking of murdering Bartleby, and without some historical knowledge of what some things going on at the time, you might have missed that. But then he quickly changes and decides not only will he not murder Bartleby, and he's going to let him stay there for as long as he wants, and he's decided that's his predestined purpose in life, is to see that Bartleby has a place to stay. That's the most important thing he's ever done, he says, in his life. And yet the very next paragraph, he changes his mind. And it's because it's affecting his business. The clients start to complain, what's that weird guy doing over in the corner, so to speak. And so, okay, and then of course, the link between food and survival, which is we don't get our food by going into the forest and hunting it down anymore. We get our food at the grocery store, and we can only get access to that grocery store with money, which we get from our bosses. So that's the system, right? So our livelihoods depend on entering that relationship that sets up these walls that interfere with human to human contact, and seeing the full humanity of one another, and to be capable of giving full charity to another just because they're a human being, not because it's an investment, which is and we see the lawyer early on in the story. That's what he's doing. So he sort of lawyers up. And he uses the language of food. And again, if we had under a different scenario, I would give you some examples of that. But he uses the language of food as well, that he will deliver up a tasty morsel for his conscience is the word is the language he uses, right? So he sees it as an investment. I'm going to help Bartleby because then I will get a good conscience. I'll get some brownie points up in heaven in the afterlife, and it becomes again another business created relationship, and that's not what Bartleby insists on something else with his rather unique form of rebellion, so to speak. Okay. Um, so anyway, and then of course he dies of starvation. So opting out of that business created construct is opting out of survival, and that's a kind of dark part of this story, I think. And that's so he dies of starvation at the foot of that wall once again, inside the tomb. So look at the language there. So I want to now quickly go to Sonny's Blues. Sonny's Blues, another I think just beautiful story. In this case, I think again we could have numerous types of thesis statements. Um, how to deal with racism is one way this story is one lens for how this story is often looked at. Two very different formulas for combating racism. One by the narrator who's trying to kind of out civil the civilized and to contradict that racist stereotype of people of color being less civilized, right? And the other is the more threatening Black Panthers, Muhammad Ali kind of in your face resistance to a culture of white supremacy. So that's one way. But what I want to focus on for that story is what the story says about dualities, and for the argument I think the story is making for human solidarity or human communion, right? And so, with that lens, what we're looking at is a broken relationship between two brothers, right? And so the question then would be, well, who's responsible for that poor relationship? And hold on. And I think your first answer would be, oh, it's Sonny. He's the screw up, right? He's the one who's been in jail and in drugs and so forth, right? But I think if you look at it a little bit closer, I think you'll see to the contrary, right? What first separates them is when Sonny goes to jail. Sonny still wants to be in contact, right? And his brother has just sworn him off, right? It's when his brother's little girl dies that he gets back in touch with his brother, and his brother says, "Wow, I really needed to hear from you. I really want it." So it's the older brother who is breaking that relationship, not Sonny, right? And here we get the symbolism I want to focus on in this story is the symbolism of dualities. Notice again, I don't. In a conversation, we would point out the numerous examples of this, but from the very beginning of the story, where perhaps I just stared at it, the newsprint spelling out his name. I stared at it in the swinging lights of the subway car and the faces and bodies of the people trapped in the darkness which roared outside. Light, dark. There, ice and fire comes right on the heels of that. The end of the story, if you look for that imagery, you'll see it as well, standing in this fire of light with the darkness surrounding them, getting out into the deep water, right? Away from the fire. So there's this, again, these dualities, these extremes, and even in the in the title, Sonny's Blues. It's interesting that Sonny is the younger brother, named kind of named for light in a way, but it's his blues, right? And then another duality with the two main characters, the older brother and Sonny, right? And so I think one of the things and then the main one is the very end of the story where the older brother, when he's listening to his brother, and that relationship has been mended when they finally come together, when the older brother's finally listening. And that's really the problem with their relationship, is that is that the older brother refuses to listen to Sonny, right? And so once he's finally listening to Sonny, and I'll read that briefly. So he had made it his. So remember at the beginning, he's struggling, but finally Sonny's hitting it. He's out in the deep water. Creole has led him there. And he's hearing it, his brother's hearing it. He made it his. and he was giving it back, as everything must be given back, so that passing through death it could live forever. I saw my mother's face again and felt for the first time how the stones of the road she had walked on must have bruised her feet. I saw the moonlit road where my father's brother died, and it brought something else back to me. It carried me past it. I saw my little girl again. I felt Isabel's tears again, and I felt my own tears begin to rise. Right. So what he's doing, and so he hears him, and then he sends up a scotch and milk. Interesting choice, right? But once again, in scotch and milk, we see that duality: scotch and alcohol, right? With milk, we now know milk's not quite as good for you as we used to think, but it used to have that kind of pure, you know, um, um, purity symbolized in it. The Bugs Bunny goes to the bar instead of a whiskey, he orders a milk. It's funny because milk is childish and innocent and pure is the idea. So it's again that mixture that he sends up, and then then he put it back on top of the piano. For me, then, as they began to play again, it glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling. Right. So the cup of trembling, if that comes from the Bible, and it's the wrath of God sent to the Israeli people, right? So now it seems even more peculiar that I'm going to send up my drug addict brother some liquor, right? That's really the wrath of God, right? And so where all that goes is what I think is that what prevents that relationship, and the reason for all these dualities and how the symbolism works in this story is because the argument becomes that it's the older brother that's failed Sonny, and he didn't follow his mother's advice. His mother said, "You got to stay with Sonny no matter what happens to him." She even uses the words, "You're going to be evil with him many a time." And he doesn't. He breaks that promise. He distances himself from his brother when he goes to prison until his daughter dies, and they get back in touch. And still, he even says at one point when they're having that discussion, um, Sonny even says, like, when his older brother's trying to lead him on the right path, Sonny just interrupts and says, "No, look, the problem is that you never listen to me. I listen to you all the time. I look up to you, but you never listen to me." And so at the end of the story, when he is listening, and his mother's tears, his Isabel comes back to him, his deceased daughter, etc. What's happening is he's getting in touch with darkness and suffering, right? And that's what prevented him from getting too close to Sonny, because Sonny is that destructive dark force. And so I think too, there's a message here about art and creativity, and destruction feeding creation, etc., that comes from Sonny's playing, but we won't go into that one as much. But the main point I wanted to show here is how, and if you look at that story again, I think you'll see just how um, common that duality symbolism is throughout the story, and how it works, and numerous examples, and leading up to that end when finally the older brother is allowing that darkness in, and in doing so he's allowing his brother back into his life, really listening and hearing his brother and hearing his brother's art, and in doing so getting in touch with the suffering of his own life, with his deceased daughter, with the racism he's experienced along with his brother, et cetera, and so on. Okay. So anyway, that's all I've got to say about those two. Shoot me an email if you have questions or just want to talk about them, because I love both of these stories, and I'm happy to talk about them anytime. But they do serve as pretty good examples of what we're looking at for in this first essay, as very sophisticated examples I expect no one to live up to, but as good examples of how we can use narrative to argue for claims that would work as academic thesis statements. A lot of you are still struggling with thesis statements, I've noticed. So if you want to shoot me an email, normally I won't look at your papers until after, but I will look at something like the thesis statement. So if you want to shoot that to me, it says, "Does this work as a thesis statement?" Then I can respond to that in some ways. Okay. So look for the instructions for your workshop, which will start at the end of this week. So we'll start it over the weekend and continue it into next week for your narrative essay. So basically, it'll be a similar thing. You'll post your rough drafts, and then I'll give you some specific ways in which I want you to give feedback to your fellow students. Okay, so be on the lookout for that. And as always, shoot me an email with questions and concerns. So hope everybody's doing well. I don't know if I'm alone in loving the fall weather and this time of year, so I hope you all are enjoying it as well. And take care, and talk to you in the next video lecture. Bye.